I've always been the kind of person who shows up. That's just who I am. When my cousin needed someone to drive 4 hours through a snowstorm to help her move, I was there. When my brother's basement flooded the night before Christmas Eve, I was the one hauling boxes at midnight while everyone else was asleep. I didn't do those things because I expected something in return. I did them because that's what family does. At least, that's what I believed for a very long time. I'm 31 years old, and I grew up in a suburb just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. My parents had been married for 34 years, and for most of my childhood, they worked hard to project the image of a close, loving family. Sunday dinners, camping trips every August, Christmas cards with all 5 of us smiling in matching plaid. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. Inside, it was a different story. But I didn't fully understand that until the year I got sick. My name's Zoe. I have one older brother. He's 37, and my parents have always treated him differently than they treated me. I noticed it as a kid but convinced myself I was imagining things. He got the car for his 16th birthday. I got a card with $40 in it. He dropped out of his first year at university, and my parents paid off his student loan without a single argument. When I needed help with my first month's rent after finishing my nursing degree, my mother told me I needed to learn to be independent. I told myself those were just small things. Isolated incidents. I told myself that a lot. In the spring of my 29th year, I started having pain in my abdomen that wouldn't go away. I ignored it for longer than I should have, the way nurses sometimes do. We're good at taking care of everyone else and terrible at taking care of ourselves. By the time I finally went to my doctor, the diagnosis came back as a large ovarian cyst that needed to be surgically removed. It wasn't cancer, thank God, but it wasn't nothing either. My gynecologist was very clear. This needed to come out, and the longer we waited, the higher the risk of complications. Here's the thing about scheduling surgery in Alberta. You don't always get to pick your date. You get put on a list, and when the OR time opens up, that's your window. My surgeon's office called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me the earliest available date was July 14th. I didn't choose that date. I didn't pick it to be difficult or to cause problems. It was simply the date that existed. The problem was that my parents had been planning a trip to Italy for over a year. 2 weeks in Rome, Florence, and the Amalfi Coast. My brother and his wife were going with them. They'd booked flights and hotels back in the previous September. Non-refundable, or so they said. When I called my mother to tell her about the surgery date, there was a pause on the phone that lasted just a little too long. That's the same week as our trip, she said. I know, I said. But that's the date they gave me. I don't really have a choice. Another pause. Well, she said, we'll have to see what we can do. I told myself that meant they'd figure something out. Maybe they'd look into postponing the trip. Maybe my brother and his wife would stay behind. I told myself not to worry. I told myself that my family would show up for me the way I had always shown up for them. I should have known better. The weeks leading up to July were tense, in a way I couldn't quite name at first. My mother called a few times to update me on what she was calling the situation. As if my surgery was an inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than something happening inside my body. She told me they'd looked into changing the flights, but the fees were too high. She told me the hotels were non-refundable. She told me that the trip had taken a year to plan, that it was their 34th anniversary, that they might not get another chance to do something like this. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue. I asked her very quietly if there was any chance one of them might stay behind with me. Just one person. I wouldn't even ask both of them. She said she'd talk to my father. 2 days before the trip, my brother texted me, not called, texted. He said he was really sorry, that he wished the timing had been different, but that flights and hotels for 4 people were too expensive to give up. He said his wife sent her love. He said they'd bring me back something nice from Florence. I sat in my apartment in Edmonton and read that text 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on the counter and stared at the wall for a long time. I want to be honest here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I was scared. Not just hurt, genuinely scared. Surgery is surgery, and even when the procedure itself is routine, you're still being put under general anesthesia. You're still vulnerable in a way that you almost never are in ordinary life. The night before an operation, you lie there in the dark and you think about all the things that could go wrong. And what you want more than anything in those moments is to know that someone who loves you is going to be in that waiting room when you wake up. My family was going to be in Rome. The one person who didn't behave like my surgery was an inconvenience was my grandfather on my mother's side. He's 79 years old, and he's been a widower for 6 years since my grandmother passed. He lives about 40 minutes outside of the city, in the same house where my mother grew up. He drives a 2018 Ford F-150 that he keeps immaculately clean, and he has a habit of arriving early to everything. Funerals, dentist appointments, birthday parties, it doesn't matter. He gets there early. He told me once that showing up on time means you're on time for yourself, but early means you're on time for other people. When I told my grandfather about the surgery, he didn't pause. He didn't say he'd have to see what he could do. He said, "What time do you need me there?" He drove into the city the night before my surgery and stayed in my spare room. He made scrambled eggs in the morning, even though I couldn't eat them. I was on a pre-surgery fast, and he sat across from me at the kitchen table while I drank my Aloud cup of black coffee, and he ate for both of us and told me stories about my grandmother, about the summer they drove across Canada in 1978 in a van they'd bought for $800. He talked about ordinary things, easy things, until I stopped thinking about the OR and started thinking about the open road. He drove me to the Royal Alexandra Hospital. He walked me to the check-in desk. He held my hand while they put the IV in my arm, which I know sounds small, but it wasn't, not to me. When they wheeled me back, he was still there. And when I woke up in recovery, groggy and dry-mouthed and confused about where I was, the first face I saw was his. That's not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. The surgery went well. The cyst was removed without complications, and my surgeon was pleased. I spent one night in hospital and was discharged the following afternoon. My grandfather brought me home, helped me get settled on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and the remote control within reach, and then quietly started doing the dishes that had been in my sink for 3 days, because I hadn't had the energy to deal with them. I didn't ask him to. He just did it. My parents and my brother landed in Rome the morning after my surgery. My mother sent a text that said, "Arrive safe, beautiful here, how are you feeling?" I stared at that text for a long time too. I wrote back okay and left it at that. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a particular kind of loneliness that I'm not sure I have the right words for yet. My grandfather came every 2 days. He drove me to my follow-up appointments. He picked up my prescriptions from Shoppers Drug Mart. He brought soup from the Tim Hortons near his house. Yes, Tim Hortons soup, don't judge, it was actually exactly what I wanted. And he sat with me and watched old episodes of Corner Gas while I recovered on the couch. We didn't always talk very much. We didn't need to. Meanwhile, my mother sent photos from the Coliseum. My brother's wife posted pictures of their pasta on Instagram. My father texted me once a forwarded joke. I'm not exaggerating. That was the extent of his communication during my recovery. There were hard days. Days where the incision ached and I couldn't sleep, and I lay there in the dark thinking about all the years I had spent being the one who showed up, and wondering how I had arrived at 30 years old, so completely invisible in my own family. Those were the thoughts I wasn't supposed to think, the ones that felt too big and too sad to look at directly. On one of those nights, around 2 in the morning, my grandfather texted me. I don't know what made him do it. Maybe he was having trouble sleeping too. The text said, "Just checking in. You doing all right over there?" I wrote back, "Not really." He wrote, "I know, but you're going to be." That was all, and somehow it was enough to get me through to morning. My family came home after 2 weeks in Italy. The trip had been extended by 3 days. They'd found a last-minute deal on a villa, apparently. I found this out not from my mother calling to check on me, but from my brother's wife's Instagram, where she'd posted a sunset photo with the caption, "Couldn't bear to leave." The night they got back, my mother called. She talked for 12 minutes, I clocked it, about Rome and the food, and how good the wine was and how she'd bought a beautiful leather bag in Florence. At the end of the 12 minutes, she asked how I was doing. "Better." I said, "Good," she said. "I knew you'd be fine." That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. Over the months that followed, I watched my family go back to normal. Sunday dinners resumed. My brother showed up with stories about Italy. Nobody ever really asked about my surgery, beyond a vague "all healed up." At the dinner table one evening, my father never mentioned it at all, not once. The whole thing seemed to have been filed away in their minds as a minor inconvenience that had thankfully resolved itself. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had been keeping a record. I didn't know about it either, at first. He mentioned it to me casually one afternoon in September, a few months after my surgery. We were sitting on his porch with cups of tea, watching the leaves start to turn that particular shade of gold that Alberta does in autumn. And he said, almost as an aside, "I've been writing things down." I looked at him. "Writing what down?" "Just things," he said. "The calls you made and didn't get returned, the dates your mother forgot, The way they talked about you at Easter last year. I've been keeping track for a while now, Zoe. Not because I planned to do anything with it. Just because. He paused, looking out at the yard. I couldn't stand the thought of it going unnoticed. The truth of it. I needed somewhere to put it down. He had a notebook, a regular spiral-bound notebook from Staples, the kind with the red cover. He'd been writing in it for over 2 years. I didn't know what to say. I sat there with my tea going cold in my hands and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. What are you going to do with it? I asked. I don't know yet, he said. Maybe nothing. Maybe just knowing it exists is enough. But it wasn't nothing. And I think, even then, he already knew what it would become. My parents' 35th wedding anniversary was in March of the following year. My mother had been planning a dinner party for months. 40-some guests at the Derrick Golf and Winter Club in Edmonton, a venue she'd been wanting to use for years. It was a big deal to her. She'd picked the menu, the flowers, the table settings. She'd asked my brother to make a slideshow of family photos. She'd asked me to organize the gift from the family. I did it. Of course I did. Because that's who I am. The night of the party was cold and clear. The way Edmonton nights in March often are. With that particular quality of stillness that comes when the temperature drops below -15 and the city goes quiet. I drove my grandfather to the venue because he'd asked me to. He said his night driving wasn't what it used to be. In the car, he was quiet. He had his notebook with him in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. I could see the slight outline of it. Are you sure? I asked him when we pulled into the parking lot. He looked at me. His eyes were very calm. I've been sure for 2 years, he said. The evening started the way those evenings always do. Cocktail hour and exclaiming over how good everyone looked. The kind of conversations where nobody says anything real. My mother was radiant in a burgundy dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. My father shook hands and laughed loudly. My brother gave me a one-armed hug and asked if I wanted a drink. Dinner was served. The speeches began. My uncle gave a toast. My parents' oldest friends spoke. My brother gave his speech, which was funny and warm and made everyone laugh and made my mother cry a little in the good way. There was a lot of applause. Then my grandfather stood up. The room went quiet in that automatic way. Rooms go quiet when an elderly man stands up to speak, because there is something about age that commands a certain kind of attention. My grandfather is not a large man. He's lean and white-haired, and he walks with a slight stiffness from an old knee injury. But when he stood up, he seemed to fill the space somehow. He started quietly, the way he always does. He talked about my parents' marriage, about watching it from the outside for 35 years, about the early days when they were young and broke, and living in a one-bedroom apartment in Sherwood Park. He talked about what it meant to build something together over a lifetime. People were smiling. My mother was dabbing at her eyes again. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the red notebook. I watched my mother's smile flicker. He opened the notebook. He put on his reading glasses. He said quietly and clearly that he had spent the last 2 years writing down what he had observed. Not to cause pain, but because he believed that a family celebration was also a moment for honesty. He said he had watched one of his grandchildren be treated differently from the other, for as long as he could remember, and he had watched that difference become most visible in the moment when that grandchild needed her family most. And then he read. He read dates and events. He read the text my brother had sent 2 days before my surgery, word for word. He'd written it down verbatim. He read the 12-minute phone call, where my mother talked about Florence for 11 of those minutes. He read the fact that my father had never, in the 9 months since the surgery, once directly asked me how I was feeling. He read the Instagram caption about the villa extension, couldn't bear to leave. The room had gone very still. I don't know exactly what I expected. I think part of me expected my father to get up and shout, to cause a scene, to do the thing people do when they're caught and they respond by escalating. What actually happened was quieter and in some ways worse. My father sat perfectly still with his hands flat on the table. My mother's face went through several expressions very quickly. Shock, then something like embarrassment, then a rigid stillness. My brother said, "Grandpa, I think you're overreacting." My grandfather looked at him. He said very calmly, "The notebook doesn't overreact. It simply records." There were people at the table, family friends, my parents' neighbors, cousins I hadn't seen in years, who had watched me my entire life and now were sitting with this information settling over them like snow. One of my aunts, my father's sister, asked, "Is this true?" Nobody answered her, which was itself an answer. The thing about the truth is that it doesn't need defending. It just needs to be said out loud in a room where it can't be walked back. That's all it needs. My grandfather understood that. He had understood it for 2 years, quietly building his case in a spiral notebook, waiting for the right moment to set it down in front of everyone. After the dinner, things were complicated in the way they always are when something real has finally been said. Some people came to find me quietly and hugged me without saying very much. My aunt, my father's sister, held my face in her hands and said, "I didn't know, sweetheart. I'm sorry I didn't know." My mother left before dessert was served. My father followed her. My brother lingered for a while, looking uncomfortable and somewhat lost, and then he left too. My grandfather and I were two of the last people to leave the venue that night. We drove back through the cold March dark, and he was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. He looked lighter somehow. Unburdened. I asked him. "I'm very okay," he said. "Are you?" I had to think about it honestly. The answer was complicated. "I think I will be," I said. He nodded like that was exactly the right answer. In the weeks after the anniversary party, there were phone calls I wasn't part of. Conversations I heard about secondhand, a family meeting at my parents' house that I wasn't invited to but my grandfather attended and reported back on in his careful, precise way. My parents were angry. My brother was defensive. There was talk of my grandfather having embarrassed the family. He told me he had listened to all of it and said, simply, that he stood by what he'd said and that he had the receipts. He said receipts, in a way that made me laugh despite everything, a 79-year-old man using that word so deliberately. I don't want to tell you that everything got fixed after that night because it didn't. Families don't work that way, not in my experience. What changed was more internal than external. My mother did eventually call me, a few weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, and it was a difficult conversation, the kind where both people are saying things they've been holding for a long time. It wasn't a resolution so much as a beginning. A first real conversation after years of performed ones. My father hasn't said much. He's not a man who finds it easy to account for himself. I think that may take a very long time, or it may never happen, and I've had to sit with both possibilities. My brother surprised me. He called one evening in April, unprompted, and talked for a long time. He said he'd been thinking about what our grandfather had read from that notebook, and that he hadn't realized. Or maybe he had realized and hadn't let himself fully know it. How differently he and I had been treated growing up. He said he was sorry. I don't know yet what his sorry will look like in practice. But it was a real sorry. I could hear it. What I know, sitting here now, is this. I spent a long time being the one who showed up for everyone else and telling myself that was enough. That I didn't need anything back. That needing things back made you weak somehow. Or ungrateful. I was wrong about that. Needing to be shown up for isn't weakness. It's just being human. We all need someone to sit in the waiting room. I was lucky enough to have my grandfather. I was lucky enough to have someone who noticed, who wrote it down, who stood up in a room full of people on a cold March night and said, "This happened and it mattered, and here is the proof." He still drives that immaculate F-150. He still shows up early to everything. Last week he drove me to a follow-up appointment. Just a routine check, nothing serious. And he was in my parking lot 20 minutes before I asked him to be. When I came downstairs and knocked on the window, he was already awake, reading a paperback with the seat slightly reclined. I got in and he handed me a coffee from the Tim Hortons on 97th Street, already fixed exactly how I take it. "You didn't have to wait out here," I told him. "You could have buzzed up, I know, but I wanted to be ready, and that, I think, is the whole thing. That's the whole story, really. Some people tell you they love you, and some people are already in the parking lot with your coffee. I know now which one matters more. And I know that no matter what happens with the rest of my family, no matter how many of those hard conversations still lie ahead of me, I am not invisible. Not to the person who matters, that's enough. Some days, it's everything.